We're excited to announce that our very own podcasting platform, Zencastr, has become a new sponsor to the show. Check out the podcast discount link in our show notes and stay tuned for why we love using Zen for the podcast.
You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
This is the CRM Archaeology Podcast. It's the show where we pull back the veil of cultural resources management, archaeology, and discuss the issues that everyone is concerned about. Welcome to the podcast. Hello and welcome to the CRM Archaeology Podcast, episode 185 for March 11th, 2020. I'm your host, Chris Webster. On today's show, we talk about managing expectations in CRM, and we get a little bit into the graduate student strike in the University of California system that's going on in early March 2020 right now. So take a look around and figure out where you stand because the CRM Archaeology Podcast starts right now. Welcome to the show, everyone. Joining me from Reno today is Bill in California.
Yep. Hello.
Heather, who is also in California.
Good afternoon.
And Stephen in Calgary.
Definitely not California.
Definitely not California. They all start with a C, though. It's crazy. All right. So we had another topic planned for today, but sometimes guests can't make it at the last minute. So we're pivoting. So that might be why the topic may sound a little bit disconnected today. We might do a little bit of a potpourri sort of thing and talk about a lot of different issues that have come up lately. Like, for example, right before the recording, we were talking about social media, and I've talked about this on a lot of things, but some of the negativity from archaeologists about archaeology on some of the social media groups. But maybe we'll get to that later. Heather, you were mentioning something before the discussion today started, so why don't you kick that off and we'll talk about it.
I was mentioning how myself and some of my colleagues, including you guys, we're experiencing just a like you said, a negativity specifically from archaeological field techs who seem to have, I love the vim and vigor and the desire to move up and to become more, to expand their skill set. But there have been, there's this assumption that they start and they're automatically going to get a full-time job. And I think in some careers that is the case. This is a unique career that you have to, you actually have to work for other companies, multiple companies usually. I mean, the fact that somebody could come in and just get a full-time job right off the bat is few and far between. It just doesn't happen right now in this discipline. So the reality is, and before I hire anyone, I always have a very long conversation with them. Say, listen, this might be different than another job that you've had where somebody expects this loyalty, where you're only going to work for them. And you're going to hear from me that I encourage you to work for other companies. It gives you experience. It allows you, there are going to be, all companies have different types of work going on. Some focus more on energy, some focus more on development or municipal, some have more municipal and agency clients. And so, being able to expand your skill set that way, on top of that, it allows you to have an influx of, work and opportunities coming in. We've talked about this before. I know, we've talked about people losing their jobs right before Christmas. And, there's nothing that's probably the worst part of being an employer is having to tell somebody you don't have work for them or having to let somebody go if you've hired them on full time. And so it's a little frustrating when we are upfront with people when we hire them, and then they get very indignant that they're not getting everything handed to them. And there's a few things there that I think would be good for people and probably even those that have been in this business for a while. I see it from texts like that too. But to understand that, the onus is on you to build your skill set. It's not going to be on the companies that are hiring you. I mean, we've talked about it before. I mean, those of us that are in a managerial position, I'm working 60 to 80 hours. I'm on salary. I don't, as much as I'd love to train people and bring them up, but the onus really has to be on the techs to build their own skill set, to look for opportunities. And I know we've said this before, but you can't just say, I'm looking for an opportunity by going to somebody, hey, give me an opportunity. You have to study. You have to continue your education. You have to be, really doing everything you can to build your own skill set and not expect that the employers are going to be looking at how they can massage your career for you. That's not the reality. That's not the reality really in any work place, but it's certainly not the reality here when in this business, we are constantly hopping. I mean, we just trying to keep our head above water with all the work that's coming in. So I'd like, instead of people just assuming that they know that they're being screwed over, really try to look at it, look at the breadth of the situation, ask questions, do a little more research before you assume that people are trying to, screw you over.
Yeah. And let me start. You mentioned the word reality there near the end. And that's where I want to start, because when you first started talking about this, it just brought me back to being a shovel bum and the constant struggle in the first probably 2 or 3 years I was in this field. I kept thinking that next job was going to let me settle down, that next job was going to turn into something full time. And my mindset while I was at that job was very different. I was very unsettled all the time. I was very, always trying to impress and jumping at different things just to show that I'm the person. Not that you shouldn't do that, because if you're, a good scientist in your career, you're going to want to learn new things, but it's the reasons I was doing it. And I was always trying to, like I said, impress to get that full-time job and do that. But I'll tell you what, does anybody here know a single person that's worked in CRM in the same company for their entire careers? Of course not. I know people that worked for a company that was pretty big here in Reno. I've mentioned them on the show before. And there were people that had only worked there since grad school and they hadn't really worked anywhere else. It was, up to 10 years for some people. And then all of a sudden, 2 weeks before Christmas, they lay everybody off. And guess what? I heard just recently that they're probably closing that office here. And the one guy that was there, for the last 20 years, he's retiring and they're going to close the office. At least that's the last thing I heard. So nothing is permanent. So if you go into this job as a shovel bum, it might be a little different if you have a graduate degree, because your opportunities for full-time employment are typically a little bit greater, because that's the type of job that is. But if you come into this as an undergrad, is it realistic to think that you could ever get a full-time job? And it's more likely that you're not. So if you come into that with that attitude, maybe your attitude would be different towards a profession in general, and it wouldn't be so negative if you know that, hey, I'm going job to job to job, and this is how this business works. And I get to travel the world, see the country on somebody else's dime, and have a good time doing it and learn stuff. So I think it's all a mindset thing. Bill?
I agree with it being a mindset thing, but also I don't think that people should give up on the idea that they're going to get a full-time job as a tech. Just like not give up, but don't pin all your hopes on it. Like you were saying though, you can make it 10 years or so and then you got to find a new job. That is just the way that it is.
Sure. I
don't care where you're working at. All these most secure careers, you could work for a hospital and be an RN, for 10 years. And then the next thing you know, you're on your head, you're sent off, you get horrible shifts and decide to switch and move. Like that's just kind of the way that it is in the 21st century. Yeah. We should all be, expecting that we'll have 85 careers or something like that. And that there is no such thing as like a safe career. The whole ideas of having that kind of Fred Flintstone slide down the brontosaurus, be off at work. Like that was a once in humanity burst that only happened for like the United States. We can all think that every job is going to be like another step in our career, and that it's going to be, this is what's happening right now for me, and that I'm going to just make the most out of this one, because then the next step is going to be at a higher level or in a different position, or I'll have to do less of the things that I don't like, right? So like rather than thinking that you're going to get complete security, maybe think that perpetual movement is just kind of the way that it is in the United States, that for the foreseeable future, or at least until you become independently wealthy, which last, couple times ago we talked about that. You're doing those strategies, then you're on a whole different pathway, and you could be in a place one day where you don't have to do anything for anyone. You can just do what you want. So I definitely, when I was a tech, just like you, always wanted to have a permanent position, and it just didn't end up happening for me until I got a master's degree. And it wasn't that I didn't try. It wasn't that I didn't get positions for multiple months. It wasn't that I didn't know how to manage my cash and that I was, absolutely frightened that I was going to get kicked out of my apartment, which that's a lot of people's lives. And I get it. I've been around, I've seen a couple of things. So yeah, yes, keep that dream. But then when you get that full-time position, just know that you should be, managing your money, keeping your connections, being ready to move on to the next thing. Because if you run it properly, you'll actually job hop and make it to a higher position at another place rather than getting laid off, right? So maybe hope for the best, that you will skip and go to another job and that'll be the thing you needed based on the experience you're getting today.
Yeah. And related to all of that, like you just said, Bill, kind of keeping your mind open that you might get that full-time job. But I think if you do get a quote full-time job, or if you end up with a job that maybe takes you through the winter, I mean, that's the most we can hope for sometimes. Like, you're working for a company. It was always those fall jobs, that you would get, that you're like, maybe this one will keep me on through the winter, and then we can settle down and, do something. But I think what gets a lot of people negative and what gets a lot of people down is that they get that semi long-term job. It's not in the field. Like, I worked on the Ruby pipeline job for like 8 months. I knew that wasn't long-term. I mean, I never even once saw company offices. I knew that I was a temporary field tech for the duration of this job, even though it was long-term. But some of those, when you get on some of those projects, that you just get that feeling from the company that maybe this will turn into some other things. And then they put you on one more project, and then they put you on one more project, and you're like, hey, this is looking pretty good. And then you buy a new car, not a new car, but a new car to you, because, hey, you've got consistent money coming in. You can afford that. Maybe they give you work over the winter. Now it's time to get an apartment. So then you go get an apartment, and now springtime comes around and they're like, yeah, contracts didn't come through like we thought they would, and you're ass out again. So now you're looking for another job, and that job you found is 4 states away because that's the only thing open right now. So now what do? I mean, the car will come in handy, but now you've got an apartment. Now, nowadays, let me just jump back on the apartment for 1 second. Nowadays, you can't do this with an apartment, but if you bought a house, let's say, or bought a condo or something like that, first off, look at the HOA regulations, because it could be an investment. If you can Airbnb that while you're gone, then that would be a fantastic thing. I think Airbnb is like the perfect side hustle for a field tech. If you can afford to buy a house, pick something up, look at the HOA regulations, because a lot of HOAs won't let you Airbnb it. But if they do let you do that, then and you can get a management agency in town to run it. At the very least, it's paying your mortgage while you're gone, but more than likely it's doing better than that, depending on where it's at. So that could be a consideration. But point is, people get settled for even a half a second in this lifestyle, and they go buy permanent job type things, and it's just like, you can't live a lifestyle for a job that is inherently nomadic, and you're buying inherently non-nomadic things, sedentary things. And it's just, you start building up all the stuff that you own, and you start building up the things that you can't move. And before you realize it, you're on Facebook complaining about CRM not giving you a permanent job, when CRM never promised you a permanent job. CRM promised you a certain lifestyle, but it never promised you a permanent job. So I think those are, well, Bill said, you always should be looking for those, of course, but it's not guaranteed.
Yeah, I think part of that is if you're working one place for a long time, and not just like one company, but like if you're like based out of like a minor city or, an urban area, and you're working for one or a bunch of different firms, and that goes on for a long time, I think that It's inevitable that someone is going to start growing roots, that they're going to become accustomed to living in that city, and that's where their friends are, that's where their apartments are, various things. It's where their life is, right? So I think that is a normal thing, and unfortunately, sometimes the bottom drops out, and that's like Bill was saying, like you could be an RN. Yeah. It doesn't. That's not an industry specific thing. Like losing that kind of stability. And we've had plenty of shows where we talk about like, okay, here's how you manage the winter, right? And most people will need someplace to live. So getting an apartment is not necessarily that bad of a thing. Just know that there may be the point when there is no CRM work or field tech work, where you live. And at that point, you need to figure out like an alternative. And that's when a lot of people drop out, right? Like a lot of people are like, you know what? Right. I would rather keep living here and doing something else than, move to an entirely new place, uproot myself, uproot my family and friends or, my relationships and get, and start all over.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's totally right. And I don't want people to get me wrong in thinking that permanent lifestyle can't be a thing. When you get to a company and you think maybe you might have a permanent job with that company, because it's never solid. Like both of you guys said, like a nurse or something like that, like an RN, there's other professions out there that are a little bit more unstable as well. My point is just don't jump the gun, chill out for a little bit, build up some savings before you start buying stuff and just, get the sense of the company. You're going to get a sense of how successful that company is and what kind of contracts they're bringing in pretty quick. So, don't jump the gun too much.
I think there's another circumstance that I've come across too, where, I have some people that come in and they really enjoy that lifestyle of, I guess having the wanderlust a little bit and being paid to have that wanderlust and moving around and doing different jobs. And I mean, we've actually had people that have turned down full-time positions because they really don't want to be locked into any one project. Well, I know we've talked about this on other podcasts. Work is work. And yes, we all strive, well, not all of us, but most people do like to have a good mix in their work of something they really love to do, but also something that's going to pay them. And, if there are, we have a unique type of personality that's attracted to this discipline and to this career set. And, when you say that I don't want to work certain projects, or I don't want to work monitoring projects, or I don't want to when you start dictating as needed employee, you just have to look at the reality of it is that when an employer is trying to place people and you have somebody who is willing to work wherever, and when people have a large skill set, they're obviously going to be more employable than somebody who has a smaller skill set. And if you have somebody who comes in and they just don't have certain capabilities, obviously they're more limited in what projects they can go onto. So it's the onus of the people that, the techs themselves to not only build their skill set, but to open up their mind to be willing to do something that isn't the ideal job, but it's going to allow them to gain some traction in the company, some trust. I mean, just like the techs have some frustrations, and I get it because I was there too for years. I know what it's like, not have wondering if I'm going to just be let go the next day, the next week, the next month. But on the other end, the people that are actually employing you have been burned too. We've had people that have said, "Oh, you know what? The night before, I can't make it. Sorry, I got a better gig somewhere else." And so both sides have to build that trust, and that's just professionalism. People have to understand that. You have to spend some time really building that trust and that level of understanding between employer and employee.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that is a good point to take our first break. We'll come back on the other side and tackle Bill's response to this, because I see his hand up right now. Back in a second. Chris Webster here for the Archaeology Podcast Network. We strive for high-quality interviews and content so you can find information on any topic in archaeology from around the world. One way we do that is by recording interviews with our hosts and guests located in many parts of the world all at once. We do that through the use of Zencastr. That's Zencastr. Zencastr allows us to record high-quality audio with no stress on the guest. Just send them a link to click on, and that's it. Zencastr does the rest. They even do automatic transcriptions. Check out the link in the show notes for 30% off your first 3 months, or go to zencastr.com and use the code CRMARC. Looking to expand your knowledge of X-rays and imaging in the archaeology field? Then check out An Introduction to Paleoradiography, a short online course offering professional training for archaeologists and affiliated disciplines. Created by archaeologist, radiographer, and lecturer James Elliott, the content of this course is based upon his research and teaching experience in higher education. It is approved by the Chartered Institute for Archaeologists as 4 hours of training. That's in the UK, for those of you that don't know. So don't miss out on this exciting opportunity for professional and personal development. For more information on pricing and course structure, visit paleoimaging.com. That's PALEO imaging.com, and look for the link in the show notes to this episode. Welcome back to the CRM Archaeology Podcast, episode 185. And We were talking about a number of things today, but most recently, in this last segment, we're going to keep talking about this. We were bringing up basically expectations, I think, and managing expectations for the types of jobs we have. And I'll mention we are also, for the first time in the CRM Mark podcast history, live streaming this recording on the APN Facebook page. So facebook.com/ArcPodNet. I don't know if I'll do this again, but I'm doing this now. So it's working out pretty well. And Richie Cruz just said, who's on the You Call This Archaeology show with me right after this. So if you're watching this on Facebook Live, we'll be coming up with Richie here at about 3:30, 4 o'clock. We got started with this one a little late. But also Chuck Hutchinson has joined in, and he always joins our live streams. And I just want to mention, because we were talking about permanent jobs, and he said there are tons of people in the federal sector that have permanent jobs with just a BA. And he's right, but that's the federal sector. And he said that's not the unicorn type of job that you think it would. But there are fewer of those available than, quote, regular CRM jobs, right? Private sector CRM jobs. So if you can find a federal job, that is your quickest path to, I would say, permanent employment. Not only permanent employment, but employment with benefits and stuff. I mean, go figure, right? So, Bill, you had a comment right before the last break. Why don't you hit us with that now?
So we've been talking so far about, expectations and everything, but the one thing that I would like to, mention is the kind of contract, the unspoken, just ethical contract that should at least exist if we're going to build trust between employer and employee. And I think, as someone who worked in CRM for a long time, sometimes I think the reaction we're getting from techs who have, have some kind of expectations is that their trust has been broken because the employer has not held up the other end of the bargain. So, we just discussed about how tech should be open and willing to take jobs, and they should be there whenever they can, because any kind of limitation slows them down. But really what we're saying is that, or what that implies is that you should be ready to do whatever the employer tells you, because they're the ones who control the money and all that other stuff. And I think what we're seeing is folks are pushing back against that. It wouldn't be that big of a problem if you worked for a company where they were actually doing right by you, and you actually understood that everyone there is working in your best interest, and you are working to further the company's goals, and that the company has, your best interests in mind when they're making decisions. But every single person on here knows that we've worked for these companies and they do not have our best interest in mind. And they do things that, violate our trust. And after that happens a couple of times, you get kind of shell shocked. You get, you add on the, poverty and the insecurity of the industry. And then you get to this point where, you're just either you're going to get out or you're going to get what you want. Right. So there is a disconnect. Folks who are skilled, that have been around for a long time and are in high demand, are the ones who can be saying, yeah, you know what, I need you to say that you're going to, keep me here for 6 months, or I'm going to need this kind of wage, or no, I don't want to do monitoring and stuff. But folks who are just starting off, they're the most vulnerable, and they're the ones who need, like, Heather was saying, a clear discussion of what this job is. And then when the person takes the job, actually, honorable treatment of, freedom from harassment, not, cheating people out of wages, not doing all kinds of stuff that, labor is the most expensive component of every project. So when you cut someone's hours 2 or 3 hours just so that the company can save $700 or whatever, like that kind of stuff is what makes techs not want to work for companies. So I don't want to mention the universe of company, like the talk behind the scenes when I was a tech of who you shouldn't work for, or you should watch out for this individual and all this other stuff. Because a lot of times it boiled down to either, unethical things that happen in the field, or nickel and diming that cost someone, $20 that was their gas money to get through the next week. And then, the next thing you know, they're like, yeah, these guys are cutting 20 here, they're 15 there. They wouldn't give me the food allowance. They made me do this. They made me do that. Almost anybody else in this state, I'll work for them, but I don't want to work for these guys.
I hate to be the bearer of bad news for people who are just getting into this field, or finishing up your first winter off and looking at your next field season, or, in a senior course in university right now, looking for a job when you get out. But again, I'll just say manage expectations. When you are a field tech and you're working a temporary job for somebody, even if this is your 3rd, 4th, 5th time in a row with these guys, from a business standpoint, you have to understand 2 things. One, most CRM firms are running right on the line of profitability, right? Running right on the line. And that's partly bad business practices, and it's partly just it's a tough industry because no one wants to pay us to do what we do. So we're always bidding really low for things, and margins are really tight. The other thing you need to know is if it's between you and one of the permanent employees and the company's welfare, you're going to lose every time. And I'm okay with that. That's just manage expectations. So if you don't want to be part of that, I guess, mindset, part of that field, then don't work for those types of firms. Work for the bigger engineering firms that can afford to, keep the CRM department afloat when things are things are going wrong. Just make sure that you work for those guys, or work for the feds, or work for somebody else, but don't go work for a mom and pop or a small operation that has one office or maybe even two offices and expect to be treated like a VIP employee. It's just simply not going to happen.
Yeah, I was thinking about when Bill was talking about the responsibility of the employer. Absolutely, a responsibility, just because they're in this power dynamic of really having the control, they have the money, they have the ability to really sink or swim these employees. Absolutely. The employees also have to understand that they have to know when they're looking at a good company, what they're looking at. Because companies that I've worked for in the past, I've worked for two different types, those that aren't and those that are good to their employees. And sometimes I still hear the same complaints from people because they're just never satisfied, or they're not willing to do the work to put the work in to further themselves in the career. And then you also have people that are just downright not treated well. But when you have a good employer, you're working for one, know what that looks like. That looks like you're being paid on time. I mean, these are the simple things. You're paid on time. You're told upfront. You're not said, we all know that we have to start, those of us that are trying to field these techs and get people in so that we can make sure we have enough people, out in the field. We don't know if the contract's going to happen that day or it's going to happen next month, but we have to be prepared. So we have to start making phone calls and get our feelers out. And so if you have a company who's upfront with you and said, listen, I'm hoping it's going to start in 2 weeks, but it may not. So that's the sign of a good and honest company. Like I said, somebody that pays on time, that's actually paying expenses, that tells you this is what you're going to get, and that is what you get at the end. But there are some things that I've noticed that people complain. They say, they don't get paid on time, yet they're not turning in their timesheets on time. They say they're not getting their per diem back, or they're not getting their expenses back immediately, yet they don't turn in their expense sheets correctly. Mm-hmm. And so, these little minor things, that's what's in, control what you can control. Those are just, professionalism 101. So I would say, to me, that would be a few. Number one, know when you're looking at a good company, know that you are looking at a good one. Number two, control what you can control yourself. And then number three, if you have an opportunity to work in the lab or to dig, even though it's maybe not it's just an extended phase one, subsurface testing, whatnot, but anything that gives you the one-on-one interaction with your employer is an excellent way for you to be able to build that relationship, and for them to, hey, I like Susie. I'm going to hire her next time. She's reliable. She's got a great attitude in the field. She's a hard worker. Those are things that, unfortunately, the employer can't see in a monitoring job sometimes. So, that's my 2 cents.
Well, and that's a good thing to note too, is companies, like you just mentioned, Heather, companies will, express their gratitude towards field tech sometimes. Maybe it's by giving them more work. Maybe it's outwardly saying something. But I think something people need to also understand is that you need to know you're only going to get a permanent job with that company if A, there's an opening, and B, they're growing. Or I guess one of those two, because somebody might leave. But if it doesn't look like they're growing that fast, and maybe ask them, say, hey, how many employees did you guys have 5 years ago? What'd your contracts look like last year? That should be information that they can at least share with you if you're getting that close enough relationship with the company. And if they're not growing, you're probably not going to get a full-time position, no matter how great you are, and no matter how great the relationship with them is. And also, another thing that you mentioned was you got a contract coming up and you don't know when it's going to start. You have an idea when it's going to start, but there's a lot of balls in the air and a lot of dominoes have to fall in place for that contract to start on time. I'm confident, because I know this has happened. I've worked for companies that have done this, but I'm confident that a lot of companies will overbook, like the airlines, right? They'll say we need 5 techs, but they say yes to maybe 7 techs, expecting a couple of them to drop out. I learned that real early on when my wife and I were applying for jobs back in our first couple of years. But because of that, we also overbooked. I mean, I said yes to simultaneous jobs sometimes because I wasn't sure which one was actually going to be real when we got a week before the start date. So, and I had no problem calling them up and saying, hey, sorry about this. I got to go because I've got this other opportunity that I said yes to first, and they came up and just, come up with something. And if they blacklist you or whatever people like to say for that, then they just don't understand the field of CRM, because that's how it works. You can't have hard feelings on either side of the table, whether you're an employer or an employee. It's just the nature of the business. And if I'm not looking out for myself, trying to make sure I'm constantly employed, I know you're not going to do it. You, Mr. Employer, Mrs. Employer, whoever that is, you're not going to do that for me. I got to look out for myself, but they also have to look out for themselves and make sure their project is staffed. So this whole episode is going to be called Managing Expectations and knowing what to do.
Yeah, I think you started on a interesting topic, which is how to kind of transfer into one of those permanent jobs. And one of the things that I always consider is, a lot of it is just being in the right place in the right time. Really, it's like all of a sudden, like if you're working for a firm and they have some full-time positions, but they're all filled, it happens where people move on and suddenly there's a slot open. And it's not about growth. It's about, like other staff leaving for whatever reason. And sometimes, like if you are the most viable candidate who happens to already be working for that firm, then you have the inside track to getting that slot. And likewise, sometimes if you're putting in that effort, like both of you were talking about, and your term ends, like the project you're working on, that ends, then sometimes if you made a really good impression, your employer will be like, hey, I know this other firm, they're looking for a slot. We can put in a good word for you and maybe you can get in. So there are a lot of options that are really hard to predict. And some of it just happens. You just happen to be at the right place at the right time. And there's no advice that any of us can give you as far as like finding that. Right? Like that's just, being there, trying to do the work, and good things happen maybe.
Yeah, I was just going to say that exactly what you were saying. And I think you just have to remember to have a cool head and remember to have a wider perspective and understand from a tech position that I doubt there's anyone, unless they're just a compliance manager and they're just hiring people and they've never been an archaeologist. But if you're working for somebody who was an archaeologist, I guarantee you that they have worked as a field tech themselves. So they know. And, you're going to have some that are going to be more compassionate than others. But when you're in that precarious position, it is what it is. That's life. You have to keep a level head and not lose your head when you're frustrated and when you're nervous about the next, being able to pay your next rent check or whatever. We get it. And you know what? Sometimes maybe having a candid conversation with the person that's been giving you the most work and say, listen, you know what? I really like working for this company. I'd like to do more work. Sometimes people don't realize, people think, the employers think you're working for multiple companies and you're doing great. And they don't know what they don't know. So if you go and you talk to them and say, listen, I really do, I'd like to work more for you. It doesn't guarantee you're going to get a full-time position, but it certainly means, now they have something real there. They have something that, kind of is more personal on a personal level. Say, you know what, Sue's a great worker and I know she really needs the work. And who doesn't like to help other people? People like to, I love to do that. So I think having that candid conversation, I see a lot of people that run scared all the time and they go, and that's just it's not a confident position. It's never a position. When you come in from a position of fear, you're not going to attract success that way. So you have to really, you have to bear down a little bit and keep your cool when you're dealing with stressful situations like that.
Hey, I'll tell you, just reiterating what you both said, Stephen and Heather. Again, it's, and also Chuck on the live stream here said good reputation spreads. And that's totally right. And I'll tell you what, my first few years in this business, and probably since then, unbeknownst to me, but I knew exactly what I was doing the first few years. I burned some bridges.
Mm-hmm.
I definitely burned some bridges because I had the wrong expectations and I had the wrong attitude and response as a result of those expectations. Right. And, if I were to look back on it, I could probably reevaluate those situations and see how I could have reacted differently. And in some cases, people were being jerks, and in other cases I was being the jerk. Right. And it's just how it was. And I didn't understand how this field was because nobody really explained it to me. And again, I didn't manage my expectations, and I didn't know what to expect. I expected one thing, I was getting another, and I was very upset by that. That's how I reacted. So, but you learn. So, all right. Well, I think because we're so close to the end of this segment, why don't we just cut this one right here and then come back and wrap this up on the other side with maybe a little more talk about this, but Bill's itching to talk about some other stuff too. So we'll see how that goes on the other side. Back in a second. You may have heard my pitch for membership. It's a great idea and really helps out. However, you can also support us by picking up a fun t-shirt, sticker, or something from a large selection of items from our TeePublic store. Head over to arcpodnet.com/shop for a link. That's arcpodnet.com/shop to pick up some fun swag and support the show. Welcome back to the CRM Archaeology Podcast, episode 185. And we are going to shift gears a little bit because Bill has been talking to us about a graduate student strike. So life on the other side of the archaeology coin here. Bill, what's up?
Yeah, exactly. Life on the side where you actually are unionized. So, if you haven't been, if you don't live in California and you're not connected to the academic world, then you probably aren't aware of the fact that several of the campuses in the University of California system, the graduate students have decided to strike, and it's not for an unfounded reason. It started off, I believe, in December with graduate students at the University of Santa Cruz who, right after finals time, after the finals had been taken, they decided to strike, kind of holding the grades of those classes as ransom to try and push for a cost of living adjustment to bring them actually in line with the prices of the area. So just so, folks know that the students are actually already part of a union. They're already part. I'm trying to look through the news here. I can't remember what the union that represents them is. They're already unionized, and their union actually did not say that it was a good idea to do this strike because they have a collective bargaining agreement that goes through 2022. So
it's a UAW, United Auto Worker.
Yeah. Oh, I didn't know that. I would have thought it would have been under SEIU, but I guess not. Okay, so Union Auto Workers, they're unionized. The UC system graduate students already had a collective bargaining agreement with the University of California Board of Regents that went for a couple more years. So the strike is not necessarily sanctioned by their union. However, I don't know how many grad students can really wait until 2022 to get more money. For example, they're not getting paid enough at all to meet the area rents, in Santa Cruz or in, I guess Santa Barbara is going to join on Monday, but students are not getting paid enough in the University of California system to actually afford rent. And so they're asking for an arbitrary cost of living adjustment that's based on living wage estimates for their area. But, at the same time, they already had an agreement that keeps going for a couple more years. So they're they're doing a wildcat strike. So this last week, the UC president said that they are violating the terms of their collective bargaining agreement and fired 50-something graduate students from the University of California, Santa Cruz, and kind of said, holding undergrad grades hostage and refusing to carry out the contracted teaching responsibilities is the wrong way to go. So participating in the wildcat strike is going to have consequences up to and including the termination of the existing students. So this is a complicated issue because, some of these folks, I presume, are anthropology students, and they aspire, at least in some way, to become cultural resource management managers or tenure track professors or something like that. And we have talked on the podcast several times about being part of a union and, field techs unionizing and how that would actually change things. So watching this whole thing unfold, you see that the union representatives make these agreements with these larger organizations, and then it's up to the employees to abide by them. But if things change and the agreement is not significant enough or something like that, then the unionized employees actually, in fact, don't have the same freedom and, mobility that you would think that they, as if they weren't unionized. Plus, it's if they do, a wildcat unsanctioned strike, they're much more likely to get fired. And then finally, it's not the panacea that many people think, but probably most importantly, the students are dealing with the same exact thing that cultural resource management, especially field techs, are dealing with. The low wages, the inability to feed oneself, to provide shelter over one's head, especially in a place like California. And so I can see how a lot of students or a lot of field techs would at least be able to relate and have some kind of solidarity with the strike. So, as someone who's teaching in the UC system, I'm watching with bated breath because it's changed the way that I, think about teaching. For example, I am much less interested in teaching classes where there's graduate students because I don't want them to hijack the students' grades in order to, use them as leverage to try and make more money or, just they need to change their life situation. They need higher wages. They need a better deal from the University of California. But, taking the students' grades as a professor, someone who's represented by a different union and who has a different obligation, that's the kind of thing that it's really concerning for me. So fortunately, I have the freedom to choose not to teach large classes. And so essentially my students, the undergrads, are the ones who get in a bind because there's fewer choices for them. There's fewer places for freshmen and, underclassmen from other departments to take classes that I teach. And, it actually makes me really wary in the future of teaching any of the large classes because, I can't really have my class hijacked. But on the other hand, being a graduate student who has suffered under this and had to work, contracts and do CRM and other stuff on the side just to pay for my kids' preschool and stuff like that as a graduate student, I absolutely understand what the strike is about. And I'm impressed that they would just decide to hold all the grades ransom. I kind of want to see how this whole thing unfolds.
Yeah. Heather.
I don't know the ins and outs like Bill does because he's right in the thick of it. But, I was a grad student, obviously, at one point. And, I was just kind of looking over one of the articles that's covering this. And they're talking specifically to the STEM students, the STEM grad students that are making considerable amount more than the social science students are. And the reason that is because the STEM students are working in chemistry research labs. So they're actually bringing in money. And I think that there needs to be some kind of talk about, number one, these departments, the social science departments, had to find some way of bringing in that money. There's very few that are actually bringing in money aside from grants and such, where you have these STEM disciplines that are doing that. I mean, these are working research labs where these students are getting practical experience. And I think this would actually kill two birds with one stone. We've talked about quite a bit about having people come, students that are coming straight out of college that really have no skills. And as CRM practitioners, we're having to teach them from scratch. So basically what they have is, 2 letters behind their name and nothing else. So if more of these humanities departments or the, anthropology department specifically, with respect to what we're talking about, would actually do some CRM work and give these students not only practical experience, but also an opportunity to make more money, I think that would help. I think the other aspect of this is that I'd like to see if any of this kind of stuff is happening on the East Coast. So the East Coast, unions are very, they're a huge part of how money works and companies work and how people are given fair wage. You don't have that out here in the UC system or California, period. There's very few careers that are unionized. And so people don't even understand the concept of unions and how the collective bargaining can work in their favor and how they have to be patient. Just like Bill was saying, that had this like wildcat type protest aside from the collective bargaining is a bit of a mistake. The idea behind unionizing is that you have a united front and that you work together steadily towards better pay, better benefits, better work environment. And that's not happening here when you have people that just, knee-jerk reaction. There's no organization to it. And it's not going to result in something positive, in my opinion, because it's not organized enough.
Right. I didn't even know grad students were unionized. I was in grad school in Georgia on the East Coast and wasn't even mentioned. I don't think they were unionized. So that's an interesting.
Mm-hmm.
No.
No, they sure as heck weren't at Arizona. If you want to see a strike break in place, it's Arizona, man. That place, they'll do whatever it takes. I can imagine it being, like Pinkerton thugs shaking down, these poetry grad students to make sure they don't unionize in Arizona, man. That place, no, there was no unionization in our grad students. Going back to the, idea of training students, though, I mean, this is also a perennial conversation. And now I'm on the inside and, as one individual who's trying to do it, there's a couple of things that hold us back. The fact that we actually work for a state agency holds us back. So a lot of these contracts, it would be really easy for us with students who are getting their health care covered by the university and, any kind of other benefits and stuff like that covered by the university to just devastate any local CRM company's wages and get these contracts and stuff like that and use student labor to get them done. And I could imagine, what that would do to the local area market. But I don't know if we would actually get some of those contracts because it is a state agency. So it's kind of a conflict of interest, right? So there's a certain kind of grants that and certain kind of organization at universities that can bring in grants. I used to work for one called the Bureau of Applied Research and Anthropology at the University of Arizona. And I feel like they did a really great job of preparing folks to be out in the field. But then again, the professors who were in that were choosing students who had actually already done CRM or had done archaeology. And so once again, they weren't, just choosing out of the list of folks who applied and saying, oh, this person's really bright and they have tons of potential and stuff. I mean, yeah, we were bright and we had potential, but also we had done archaeology before because you can't just have us go out there and do these projects without, any kind of experience. So when it comes to the grad students and the grad programs of bringing in grants, there's only a certain kind of student that can actually do that. And unfortunately, it's someone who's already gone to Heather's company and learned half of the stuff and then comes to another university and uses that to get grants to learn even more. That becomes a more prospective candidate for most jobs. And then the final thing is the discussion about, the universities are supposed to be teaching, like there's all these obligations and stuff that we're supposed to do already for their matriculation that are set by the state, that are set by other organizations. And so, yeah, they're kind of, dinosauric or whatever, but in some ways we don't have just 4 years of them to take, 21 credits of pure archaeology fieldwork, which would rule. That would create a complete archaeologist, but instead they have to take a whole bunch of other courses and then they have these other obligations to get this well-rounded education. And even at the grad student level, if you give a student the option to work and make money versus just taking what they get, scraping by, and then obsessing forever about their PhD, half of the students will actively not take a position because they want to just work really hard on their PhD because there's all this pressure and all this discussion about how important it is to get this PhD done, how important it is to, do a great job on this thing. So folks will refuse jobs. They will refuse contracts. I know several people who can't even find graduate students who will help out at 20 hours a week on projects. And so they either, outsource it to other professors who have less than 20 hours a week to do anything, or find undergrads to do the job who will do it for 20 hours a week. I mean, I can't say that the grad students don't have a reason for striking and trying to get a better wage, but I can say that there's opportunities that I think sometimes in select cases, folks are passing up chances to work on jobs because they feel like they need to stay all day and all night working on their PhD rather than, treating the PhD like you just get that thing done and move on. Meanwhile, you're building a career on something else like we did at BARA or other organizations.
I think as far as the curriculum, I totally understand what you're saying, Bill. There's requirements, but, I've seen a lot of anthropology programs that have some pretty outlandish classes that are not necessary. Or, you have an option for electives, being able to offer electives that that are really practical. And it sounds like that's what you're doing, Bill, but a lot of these programs aren't doing that. And I think maybe the curriculum actually really does need to change because, the archaeology or the anthropology of alcohol or, certain certain classes are not necessary, although they might be fun because I did take that and that was a fun class, but it certainly wasn't helpful in me building my skill set. So, I think that there needs to be a major discussion in how curriculum is changed so that we are producing out of the university, even with the BA, people that really can jump into the field with at least a modicum of understanding and that are trainable. That is the responsibility of the university, is to be able to prepare them to have a job. They're not doing that right now, or a lot of the programs are not doing that right now. Yet they're requiring certain classes that really are not helpful. So I understand the GEs, but when you get into your second and third year, maybe I do understand having the concept of having theory classes, because obviously, archaeology does underpinned with anthropological theory. That's important. But I think it goes a little too far. And they haven't, they're not understanding that archaeologists have separate skills that are necessary in order for them to really go into the job market and be successful. So I think these curriculums really need to have a complete overhaul.
Yeah, I don't know about overhauling, because that would require us overhauling how people view the university, right? So the professors would have to be like, yeah, my job really is to train people to work in the workforce. When, that's not actually, in fact, going to happen from a lot of faculty who want to teach these anthropologies of, other stuff, right, that don't actually get you a job. But, Stephen is our stalwart believer in, higher education. And it took him only 8 years and me working at Cal for 2 years to actually realize the truth of what he was saying, that it's a chance for you to learn the kind of stuff that you're not necessarily going to learn. And the minute you get out there, having those abilities to be interested in a wide range of stuff and having those kind of abilities to learn and educate yourself, that really actually is the most important thing about the college degree. And when it comes to archaeology, teaching an individual to do that kind of thing towards archaeological things is important for us all. But just, creating the kind of individual that's able to learn and is interested in a wide range of things. I understand what you're saying, that you could take it way over into left field. But, I've been a convert. It only took, a decade to beat me down, but I'm getting closer to Stephen's Island in his belief.
I feel like we need to revisit the tech school argument that the perennial tech school argument, that education is not a tech school, or at least university isn't. The idea that we are going to train you how to do, specifically this one particular job it's a bad plan for it's a bad plan for education. It's a bad plan for the student, because that's not necessarily the job that they're going to get. And it's not necessarily the job that they're going to get for a period longer than 3 years. And we've done entire shows on this, and maybe we need to revisit that a bit.
So what job do they get?
Well,
what job do they get?
What job?
If they're not getting a practical job in archaeology, what job are they getting from an anthropology degree?
Well, what job are they getting from any degree?
Well, a huge
If
range
you go out
of
and
jobs.
you get a music degree, you don't necessarily become a professional musician.
Yeah.
If you go out and you get a statistics degree, that's a little bit more practical, and you can end up doing all sorts of statistics things. But a lot of times, particularly with humanity-focused degrees, you go out and you get more businessy oriented jobs. That there are plenty of jobs. Well, plenty. There are jobs, and traditionally, a lot of times, you get your university degree, particularly at the bachelor's level, and you go out and you get. And you do the hiring field, and you start at the bottom, you work your way up in businesses and stuff like that. And you figure out long term what you really want to do.
I agree. But what about the archaeology degrees? That's specifically an archaeology degree. Maybe they shouldn't be offering archaeology degrees then.
They shouldn't.
Anthropology. Okay, well then we agree there. That's my problem, though. You're in the university system. They're selling archaeology degrees with the concept that they're going to get jobs as an archaeologist, and then they're not preparing them for it. That's my problem.
Well, I don't know if Cal's doing that because we have an anthropology degree. All the places I went, I got an anthropology degree.
No, but there are archaeology degrees. There's several. In fact, almost all the Cal states have archaeology degrees. The specific archaeology degree.
Sure. In that case, I do agree they should be preparing folks.
I'm going to disagree with you on that. Like, just because it's an archaeology degree does not maintain the expectation that you are going to continue on in that particular field. And in the same way that just because you have an anthropology degree doesn't mean that you're going to continue on being an anthropologist.
Then why don't we just all call it liberal arts degree then? I mean, if we're going to be broad that way.
If it's an archaeology degree, you would hope that the individual finishing would be able to get a job in archaeology. The same thing with statistics. You would hope that if they're getting something that specific, you would think that in anthropology that you would be able to get a job in anthropology. And in fact, the only way to get a job in anthropology is to have a degree in anthropology. So they are kind of correct on that.
And if you go to chemistry, you go and you get a degree in chemistry, you go straight to a lab, you say, I have a degree in chemistry. You can't go to a chemistry lab and say, I have a degree in anthropology, give me a job. Why? Because when in their chemistry, in the chemistry degree program, they're teaching them how to work in a chemistry lab.
But that's what field schools do.
Hang on for a second. We're going back to the...
No, 3 weeks of what?
But hang on, though. Everyone, we're going back to the beginning where we were saying that folks are finishing with a college degree and don't have the skills to work in that field because a huge chunk of that has to be on the job training. It's just not possible really to teach every single thing. We can do the best that we can, but
Absolutely.
we can't just have someone march out with a BA in chemistry. I mean, I think that is part of the unrealistic expectation that we've talked about the whole show, that you would just take your anthro degree and knock on someone's door and say that my name is Bill White and I am ready to do archaeology. And that they would say, come this way, young boy, here's a shovel and here's your desk. Like, sit on down and we're going to go out there and discover. Like, that's not really like what ends up happening.
Bill, they don't know anything. Bill, they don't. They're coming out of the universities with no skills. They do not know anything. They really don't. And
in the article that they talk about that, and it was written in like 1973, and it was, I can't even remember who the guy's name was, but he wrote it for Great Basin Archaeology, and he had a whole spiel of what universities were supposed to teach CRM. And this was like 4 years after they had, actual CRM laws. And he was talking about, he said exactly the same thing, that all of the new anthro students, they don't know anything and they can't tie their shoes and all this other stuff. And then it was the university that was supposed to teach them. And, 50 years later, we're in the same boat, right?
Yeah. I mean, this is not a curmudgeon on my part here. This is just, and I don't expect a lot. I really don't. But at least just a 101 level of being able to go out and do work without they literally, I could bring somebody in who never took an archaeology class and compare that to somebody who has a BA in archaeology. And sometimes they're going to be very similar in the amount of training that they need to do. And that's not the fault of the student. In many cases, they're not being taught that they had the anthropological theory background. They may know how to measure and microblades, whatever, but they do not have that practical understanding, just the basic level. And really, I think it would only take probably 2 classes, but the universities are not willing to do that. To me, I would understand it if there was a lot of really hardcore stuff that's being taught. But when you have electives and you have classes that students are taking that are as, mundane or unuseful as the anthropology of alcohol, and I just keep saying that because that's what's popping into my head as my memory, that there's no excuse for that. There should be classes that are available. And you know what that's going to take? It's going to take people like you, Bill and Stephen, that actually had that CRM background that are teaching these classes, not professors that have never worked in CRM teaching CRM classes. You see that too. The one CRM class you have, and you have somebody who's never even worked in CRM. So I'm off my soapbox.
Okay.
Yeah. I like that ending too.
I'm going to end it with Heather because you're right. And hey, I'll just give I've been staying out of this conversation a little bit, but I'll give my 2 cents. I got my master's degree at the University of Georgia at a very special CRM program that they had set up, a 1-year CRM program. And to their credit, I mean, they did bring in some CRM company owners to have lectures with us on some of our discussion classes, but none of the professors were in CRM. And they actually shut that program down a few years after I left there and got my degree because they recognized that fact. They recognized that they had nobody with CRM experience teaching the CRM courses. Now at a place like University of Georgia, they do work really closely with a lot of CRM firms. So it's not like they don't know what the field is. They're just career academicians and not CRM archaeologists. So they shut the program down because they couldn't find anybody in CRM with a PhD that wanted to teach that course. So I don't know. There you go. There's a lot of good comments on Facebook on the live stream here. So check out the live stream from today is March 1st. 2020. If you want to see some of those other comments, I don't have time to get through them all, but I really appreciate everybody joining us on that. And I shared it out late to a bunch of other groups. So we've got actually 9 people watching right now, which is awesome. So we will end this recording right here. I'm glad I let this run long because that was a great discussion right at the end there. Yeah, I think we could have gone a lot longer on that. This should have been its whole show. So that's going to be it for this episode of the CRM Art Podcast. Thanks everybody for joining us, and thanks everybody for joining us on the live stream as well. I think we're going to try to do this again in the future. March is going to be tough from an internet standpoint, but this new GoPro camera makes it super easy for me to do this. So we'll do that, and we'll see you guys next time. That's it for another episode of the CRM Archaeology Podcast. Links to some of the items mentioned on the show are in the show notes for this podcast, which can be found at www.arcpodnet.com/CRMArcPodcast. Please comment and share anywhere you see the show. If you'd like us to answer a question in a future episode, email us. Use the contact form on the website, or just email chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com. Support the show and the network at arcpodnet.com/members. Get some swag and extra content while you're there. Send us show suggestions and interview suggestions. We want this to be a resource for field technicians everywhere, and we want to know what you want to know about. Thanks to everyone for joining me this week. Thanks also to the listeners for tuning in, and we will see you in the field. Goodbye.
Bye. No doubt.
Bye.
Goodbye.
No reason to smile.
No Doug for the live stream version. That sucks.
Oh gosh, I don't have anything.
This is going to take 2 weeks for him to say goodbye.
Yeah, he is. He's going to bomb in and get in there and hijack the stream and say bye.
He's probably counting down now.
This show is produced and recorded by the Archaeology Podcast Network, Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle, in Reno, Nevada, at the Reno Collective.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.arcpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
Thanks again for listening to this episode and for supporting the Archaeology Podcast Network. If you want these shows to keep going, consider becoming a member for just $7.99 US a month. That's cheaper than a venti quad eggnog latte. Go to arcpodnet.com/members for more info.